The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene and you're listening to Durian ASEAN. On our Durian Heat today, we will be talking about the recent visit by US President Barack Obama and the US interests in ASEAN. On the title today, Rethinking US Interests in Southeast Asia, we have Elina Noor. She's the Director of Foreign Policy and Security Studies at ISIS Malaysia. First of all, thanks for coming and talking to us.
Thanks for having me.
And yeah, I think the most obvious question that I will ask, the first question would be, what is the purpose of Obama's current visit, his second visit to Malaysia in fact? What is the main agenda?
Well, so Obama was here earlier in the year, and as you correctly pointed out, it's his second trip to Malaysia, which is something quite significant because, as you know, we hadn't had a sitting president of the United States in office come to visit us for decades since he did. And he, like his previous trip to Kuala Lumpur last time around, was here for... Actually, no. This time around, he was here for the ASEAN meeting. ASEAN-related meetings, rather. Primarily the ASEAN-US meeting, as well as the East Asia Summit.
Mm-hmm. And what was his agenda, the main agenda when it comes to ASEAN?
I think it was to underscore the US's place in Asia and the Asia Pacific at large. It was to assure allies in the region that the US is here to stay as part of its rebalancing strategy, and to assure partners that countries in Southeast Asia have a firm friend in the US.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to see that when it comes to the US interest in Southeast Asia, it hasn't been that significant until recently. Is that a reason why? Is that any particular issue that the US has taken a slight change towards its foreign policy in Asia or ASEAN?
Some would argue that has in fact been the case, that the US has not been present up until it decided to coalesce a whole strategy around the Asia Pacific, namely through its pivot or its rebalance. But actually, I would argue to the contrary. The US has been in the region for as long as we can remember. Sometimes its political presence has waned, as we saw when the Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice did not attend some of the ASEAN-related meetings in the region. But operationally, I think the US has been in Asia and ASEAN countries for a very long time. It's had its bases here for ages now.
Mm-hmm.
And its military presence, I think, is quite significant even in some Southeast Asian countries. So economically, maybe the US presence has shrunk a little, particularly in Malaysia, where trade figures have dropped between both our countries. But as a foreign direct investor, the US has been among the top 3 in Malaysia for a very long time now. So I would argue actually that while politically and diplomatically the US presence has been in flux, at the other levels, at the working level in particular, the US has been very firm in its presence in ASEAN, the ASEAN region, for a long, long time.
Mm-hmm. So business as usual for the US. Let's talk about political and security in Southeast Asia with the focus on maritime security, because this is one of the areas that President Obama has been quite vocal on, even though the US may have not such a significant, I would say, interest or agenda in it, but it has been echoing about the South China Sea issue in various meetings, either bilateral meetings or some of the main summit. Why do you think the US is very interested in the South China Sea dispute and to somehow meddle into the muddy waters?
Um, the U.S. obviously is not a claimant in the South China Sea territorial dispute, but like other external parties, is interested in maintaining what it calls the freedom of navigation in international waters in the South China Sea.
Mm.
And it, along with some of the other countries in the region that are not claimants, are interested to see those sea lines of communication preserved because a lot of trade flows in the waters around this region. And so it takes a direct, maybe an indirect interest in what goes on in the South China Sea because the passageway to trade and investment for these countries that are not claimants are as important as the territorial dispute is to some of the claimant countries in the South China Sea.
But what it is in for the US in this case?
Several things. It's interested in preserving, in upholding international law that underscores this freedom of navigation. Also, obviously, it's interested in protecting the trade flows and ships that pass by the South China Sea. Also, I think it's interested in assuring some of its more nervous allies in this dispute that it is there as Big Brother, if you will, to protect and uphold the principles of international law that all countries should live by.
Mm-hmm. But the irony is the issue of South China Sea dispute has been there for quite some time, but why only recently that the US has taken a strong stance on this?
Well, I think it depends who you ask. We've heard some Chinese assertions that the South China Sea dispute did not blow up, metaphorically speaking, until 2010 when then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton intervened with her remarks at the ARF.
Mm-hmm.
Some would argue that the territorial dispute in South China Sea did not become an issue until all claimant states had to submit their claims to the United Nations. And so previously it was acceptable to just leave the claims a little vague, but then once you had to concretize your claims, that became an issue, and so positions hardened. And some would say that the dispute did not become a huge issue until certain countries began reclaiming and arguably militarizing large parts of the area. As you can see from satellite images now, there are countries that have reclaimed reefs and turned them into artificial islands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And do you think U.S. presence at the South China Sea, at the center of the conflict, has somehow made the situation better or worse, especially when it comes to dealing with China?
It's hard to say whether it makes things better or worse. I think the U.S. is probably the only power in the region that is able to enforce freedom of navigation. And so to some countries in the region, that is a welcome presence because the claimant countries, apart from China and the South China Sea, are, as you know, very small, comparatively speaking. And many do not have the capabilities to stand up to larger powers. So in terms of size, influence, and capacity to actually enforce international law, the U.S. is probably the power that is able to do that. And so for countries that are nervous about its own ability to enforce international law, so to speak, in these disputed waters, the U.S. presence is certainly very welcome.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I think it does make countries in the region also very nervous about escalation because sometimes it's a miscalculation that can end up in very risky outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, we'll take one short break. When we return, we'll discuss further on other areas that the U.S. President Barack Obama were highlighting during his visit to Malaysia and also the Philippines during APEC?
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene and you are back with me on the Durian Heat where we discuss on critical issue in Southeast Asia, this time with a focus on the US interest in Southeast Asia pertaining to the recent visit by President Barack Obama to the ASEAN summit as well as to APEC these last 2 weeks. So speaking with you, Elina, Noor, I actually want to add more to the discussion on the South China Sea. During the APEC meeting, President Obama actually spoke to China about halting the construction and militarization of the disputed area in the South China Sea in one of the ways to lower the tension that has been created. Do you think China would actually listen to what the US say?
Well, every country is going to act in its own national interest. That's the reality of it. And every country will calibrate its response according to its national interest. So, I think to boil it down to whether or not China or any other country will listen to the US or, again, any other country in the region might be a little too simple a way of looking at things. It's also much more than the South China Sea. Of course, there is always a focus on that because it is a real issue and a dispute. But in terms of the US-China relationship, there is more to it than just what's going on in the South China Sea. So I think we have to look at those ties as a whole. There's trade and investment, there are people-to-people exchanges going on, and there are a lot of mechanisms. I think there are about 18 mechanisms currently that are going on between the US and China to try and improve relations as well as reduce the gap between them.
I see. So these are just one of the issues that the US have to deal with. Another issue that has been the center of discussion both at APEC as well as at the recent ASEAN summit was the issue on countering terrorism. In fact, it wasn't just the US, but all the countries that were involved, including UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon had echoed the sentiment towards counter the terrorist activities, especially in the Middle East and worldwide. Why terrorism has become such a global agenda, even in the Asia Pacific?
I think, the fact that terrorism was discussed at APEC brings to mind the immediate aftermath of 9/11 when terrorism was also discussed at APEC. I mean, APEC, as you know, is primarily supposed to be an economic forum, but security was brought into the mix. And this time around, it's probably a lot more serious, a lot more urgent because the reach of groups like ISIL and the like has reached all corners of the world. We've seen from Paris to Mali recently in just 2 weeks, Beirut to Baghdad. So, and even here during the ASEAN summit and related summits, we had a leaked police memo about the threat of suicide terrorism in this country. So I think people who were probably not as exposed to the risks and threat of terrorism before are certainly being made more aware and cognizant of how urgent and pressing the threat is. And so that's why there has been a lot of talk about terrorism. Also, I think some of the methods of brutality that we witnessed on social media by ISIL, I prefer to refer to them as Daesh, which is the acronym for them in Arabic. Because there's nothing Islamic about that group, as leaders have said, it's brought home to us just how barbaric some of the actions that have been taken can be. And once these fighters return back to their home countries, there's a risk, a very real risk, that some of those methods will be employed at home.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to the U.S. Intelligence on the terrorist activities in the Middle East, and with a focus on ISIS and ISIL and also Daesh in this case, how reliable it has been in helping the US fighting global terrorism?
I think the intelligence has not only come from the US. There has been a lot of intelligence exchange and cooperation among all countries because the threat is so widespread. So I don't think anyone or any one country is relying on just US intelligence. There is local intelligence as well that is gathered on the ground. And there's also intelligence at it's not only the national level, but regional and international levels as well. So there are a lot of intelligence flows, I believe, that are taking place to try and counter a group like Daesh.
Mm-hmm. So globally, the intelligence forces around the world are working together or cooperating together to counter the likes of ISIS and other terrorist groups.
Yes, and that's done through formal agreements and treaties, but also informally through networks.
Mm-hmm. The recent press conference by President Barack Obama in Malaysia, he spoke extensively about countering terrorism and to not give in the fear and feeding the ISIL propaganda. What will the US do in the Asia Pacific with a focus on Southeast Asia in countering terrorism?
I think the US has this time around taken more of a supporting role in this region rather than imposing initiatives upon this region. So for example, because countries in this region themselves feel the heat of this terror threat, they are more they're proposing more initiatives themselves. So in the past, if you recall, we had set up the Southeast Asia Regional Center for Counterterrorism with the assistance and support of other countries. But this time around, I think there is a lot more focus on countering the narrative of a group like Daesh. And Malaysia itself has proposed that we have a counter-messaging hub for this region. So that's one of the proposals, and I think the US has voiced support for that. But also there's been support and assistance in terms of capacity building and trying to up the level of technical skills in this region to not only counter the narrative and messages of groups like Daesh, but also in other ways, training programs, technical skills exchange. All that has been ongoing for a long time, and I think it continues to this day. If not, it ramped up even more.
Mm-hmm. We'll take another short break. When we return, we'll discuss further on the economic side of the US visit to Southeast Asia.
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene. You're back with me again, and also with Elina, Noor, discussing on the US interest in the Southeast Asia. So earlier on, we discussed about the South China Sea, and we also highlighted issues related to terrorism. But on the other hand, I think the major discussion that a lot of the people in Southeast Asia were curious on the US President Obama's visit to Southeast Asia would be the issue related to the TPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership. In fact, there were protests happening both during the APEC as well as during the meetings at the ASEAN summit that were anti-US and anti-Obama sentiments. What is your overview on the TPP issue? Why there's such mixed messages about the TPP, either among the people, civil society, and also the ASEAN leaders?
it's strange in a way because this country, Malaysia, has conducted trade agreements forever since independence without a lot of fanfare, and this has been the norm. So it's curious to me that the TPP has become such a huge issue in the public eye, and not just here, but also in other TPP negotiating countries, including the US. And for this country, I think there are several reasons. One of which is that there are several legitimate concerns about how the TPP will shape and influence, if at all, some of the policies in this country. There are people who are very concerned about the price and cost of medication, for example. And then there is also the fact that some people view the TPP as US dominated, and another example of the US pushing its hegemony on the rest of the world. Whether or not this is true, some people have very firm views on this, but I think that, look, this is a 12-party negotiated agreement. And some countries are going to win, some countries are going to lose out. And I don't think it's fair to ascribe dominance to any one country, because that sort of implies that we in Malaysia or any other country cannot hold its own in negotiating agreements, which we've previously done before. So it's still strange to me how come there's all this uproar over the TPP when we've negotiated so many other agreements in the past without similar response.
And also, just to highlight on the sideline, RCEP as well as AEC were also part of the discussion in some of the other summits with other leaders that were involved. But the TPP itself, I think it's such a hot topic, partly because it's the US that is part of the agreement, and also partly because the US has been actively, especially President Barack Obama, actively echoed the importance of TPP. I think during the town hall visit with the YC delegates, as well as during several of the press conferences, many times he gave his opinions about the importance of TPP in the Asia Pacific region. What do you think of this? What's your perspective on this?
Let me go back a little, and I think this relates to your earlier question about why the TPP is such a big issue. The TPP, as the US has been selling it to the rest of the world, is going to be a 21st century trade agreement, right? Because it's not only an agreement on trade and services, it's also an agreement that includes issues like intellectual property, like labor rights, like the environment, which traditionally may or may not have been an integral part of any one trade agreement. So there are these intangibles and qualitative components of the TPP that are quite new, so to speak. And I think you're right. Part of the controversy surrounding the TPP is because the US has come out so forcefully for it. I was at the ASEAN Business and Investment Summit where Obama spoke, and his main message that I heard was that a TPP equals progress. And because of this, constant marketing, right, and selling of the TPP as something progressive that countries need to get their foot into the door in the first instance, there is a lot of hesitation about what it means, not 5 years from now maybe, but 50 years from now, and how it'll change a country's operations and impact on sovereignty.
And besides the TPP, is there any other economic interest that the US has towards the Southeast Asia region that were discussed?
The TPP, I think, is sort of the key element of the key economic element of the US's rebalance. There have been a lot of criticisms domestically in the US that the US rebalance has lacked an economic element, and the TPP is supposed to be it. So, the US and Malaysia tried to negotiate an FTA in the past, as you know, and that fell by the wayside.
Yep.
So this is supposed to reinvigorate trade, not only between the US and Malaysia, but also with all 12 countries. And the idea, as the US has been selling it, is that it's supposed to be a pathway towards an FTA, right? A free trade agreement of the Asia Pacific. Free trade arrangement.
Does the US have any goal of making the Asia Pacific region as its number one market or its main trade partners? Because if you look at significant trade partners, even not just in Malaysia but among other ASEAN leaders, China seems to be on top of the list, including Japan and even European Union. But the US doesn't seem to top most of the countries' list of major trade partners.
And so the TPP is meant to boost the US's trade standing for itself and with other countries. I think it's inevitable that China is the largest trading partner for a majority of countries in the world. I think, it's about, China is a top trading partner, if I'm not mistaken, for like more than 100 countries now. And so that's why both the US and China have been very careful about not excluding each other out of regional trade arrangements. So, for example, there's this argument from the ground that the TPP excludes China because the US wants to maintain its dominance over the region. That may or may not be true. I don't think it's all about China, because the US has said that China has not been excluded from the TPP process. And earlier on, China had been considering being a part of the TPP, but I think both sides and all other countries agree that perhaps now is not the right time for China to do so. That does not mean that China is excluded from participating in later rounds of TPP negotiations.
With Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei and Singapore being part of the TPP and the US actively selling it, do you think other Southeast Asian country would follow suit? I mean, the biggest, I guess, country that I can see now would be Indonesia, trying to see whether, TPP would benefit them or not.
Well, I think countries will decide whether they are ready or not to participate in the TPP at a time that is right for them. Certainly the US has an initiative called the E3 initiative, meant to prepare countries for eventual accession to the TPP, because there are countries that are prepared to meet the conditions of the TPP at this stage, and there are countries that are not. I mean, as you know, it's been such a thorny process for the 12 initiates to begin with. If when you bring in other countries into the mix, even at a later stage, it can be a little complex. So I think every country will decide an appropriate time for itself to consider joining the TPP.
I see. And on the last issue that I want to highlight during President Obama's visit would be his comments on Malaysia's politics. He has been quite vague, but at the same time, he does use certain keywords that Malaysians in general has been echoing, majority of Malaysians, which is the word on transparency, good governance, responsible government. What actually is the main message that President Obama is trying to echo towards Prime Minister Najib Razak?
It's always very tricky for a foreign leader, particularly the foreign leader of, arguably the most powerful country in the world, to come in and comment on internal affairs of any country. We saw how it went horribly wrong when Al Gore did that in 98. And so I think since then, US leaders have tried to keep a balance between not offending the host country and upholding not only the values that it itself cherishes domestically, but also the values that are increasingly becoming more important to the local citizens themselves. So you were at YCL and you heard some of these issues being brought up, issues of good governance and transparency and accountability. And I think, President Obama took his cue from the young leaders of this country and the region, because they themselves raised those issues as a concern to them. And, there's this, I think it was widely reported in the press that when one Malaysian brought up those issues, he said he was going to discuss them anyway during his meeting with Prime Minister Najib. But now that it had been raised during that YCL event, he would be sure to raise those issues because they were of concern to the Malaysian citizens themselves.
Mm-hmm. He also had a site visit with the Malaysian civil society. What transpired out of that? What do you think?
I was not party to that meeting, so my knowledge is only limited to what's been reported. But I think it was important for the US to show, not only to its own domestic audience in the United States, but also to others watching, even in this country, that the US, while it engages with government, is also very interested in the work of civil society. And I guess in this case, the work of civil society in promoting and advancing the causes of good governance, transparency and accountability that other Malaysians are concerned about.
Mm-hmm. But then on another U-turn, the Malaysian civil society, in this case being reported was Percy said that the US was being a bit of a hypocrite. Why do you think they make such remarks?
You'll have to ask Verse that, but I think no country is white as a sheet in terms of the human rights record, including the United States. But I think in this country we have a tendency to rely on external powers, particularly the US, to try and correct what we see as what's wrong or what's weak in this country. And I think we have to be very careful about playing our cards that way, because the change that some people desire in this country needs to be organic, and it might be a misstep in strategy to try and rely on the US all the time to impose some of the changes that are wanted.
Mm-hmm. That's all for our discussion today. Thanks for sharing your views at Durian ASEAN.